The Strait of Georgia is not a place that gives up its secrets willingly. On a cold, steel-gray morning in late November, the water is a mirror of the overcast sky, a flat, endless expanse of monochromatic tension. There is no wind. The cedar trees on the nearby islands are motionless, ghosted by a low-hanging mist that clings to the water's surface like breath on a window pane. The silence here is heavy. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of holding one's breath. From the vantage point of a drone hovering 400 feet above the slate-colored sea, the world below looks dormant, almost dead. But then the surface breaks. It doesn't shatter with the chaotic splash of a fish jumping or the clumsy paddle of a human swimmer. It slices open. A black dorsal fin, tall as a man and sharp as a scythe, cuts through the glass. Then another. Then a smaller, curved gray fin, moving in perfect, synchronized rhythm with the first. They rise and fall together, two respiratory plumes misting into the cold air, one massive and powerful, the other sharp and quick. Under the water, the shapes are distinct, the hulking, white-patched bulk of an orca and the sleek, torpedo-like form of a bottlenose dolphin. They are not chasing each other. They are not fighting. They are swimming shoulder to shoulder, pectoral fin to pectoral fin, moving with a singular, terrifying purpose toward the open ocean. In the wild, this should be a murder scene. In the wild, the wolf does not walk with the lamb. But here, in the gray margins of the Pacific Northwest, the laws of nature have been suspended. They are not enemies today. They are partners. And they are hunting something that neither could catch alone. If you want to uncover the strange, often unsettling realities of the natural world, and the true stories that science is only just beginning to understand, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are diving deep today into a mystery that challenges everything we know about the ocean's hierarchy. You won't want to miss what happens next. To understand why that image, a killer whale and a dolphin swimming in tandem, is so deeply wrong, you have to understand the biological trench warfare that usually exists between these two species. For millions of years, the relationship between the Orcinus orca and the Tursiops truncatus has been defined by a single, brutal dynamic: predator and prey. Orcas are the ocean's apex controllers. They are the supreme architects of marine violence. A transient orcapod relies on marine mammals for survival. They toss seals into the air to skin them. They drown gray whale calves by laying their massive bodies over the blowholes. They ram dolphins with the force of a car crash, rupturing internal organs before the first bite is even taken. Dolphins, in turn, are wired to flee. Their entire evolutionary trajectory has been an arms race against the black and white giants. They develop speed, echolocation, and erratic evasion patterns, specifically to avoid ending up in the stomach of a killer whale. When a dolphin hears the specific dialect of a transient orca, it does not get curious. It runs. It runs until its heart bursts. So, when marine biologist Dr. Aris Thorne saw the drone feed on the monitor of the research vessel Sentient, his first instinct was to check the timestamp. He thought he was looking at a glitch, a composite image, or perhaps a very grim recording of a chase about to end in blood. "Rewind that," Thorne muttered, leaning closer to the high-definition screen. The cabin of the Sentient smelled of stale coffee, wet neoprene, and diesel fumes, the universal perfume of oceanography. Go back 10 seconds. Look at the spacing. His assistant, a grad student named Elena, who had spent the last 3 weeks cataloging seal populations and looked as tired as the boat felt, tapped the keyboard. The footage reversed. The black fin and the gray fin slid backward through the water, unbreaking the surface. "There," Thorne said, pointing a calloused finger at the screen. "Look at the proximity. They are less than 2 feet apart. If that was a hunt, the dolphin would be taking evasive action. It would be porpoising, zigzagging, trying to break the line of sight. Look at its fluke beats. Steady, rhythmic. It's matching the orca's drag wake. Maybe it's drafting?" Elena suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Like a cyclist? Saving energy? You don't draft behind a tank that wants to eat you, Thorne corrected, grabbing his jacket. Identify the individuals. I want ID shots on both of them. We need to know who is breaking the rules. Ascension throttled up between Yamaha outboards, growling as the 20-foot aluminum hull cut through the chop. They were 3 miles off the coast of Vancouver Island, in a stretch of water known for strong currents and deep trenches. It was a hunting ground, usually for the T transients, the mammal-eating orcas that patrolled these waters like a gang of silent bikers. The water here was dark, fueled by the nutrient-rich upwelling, hiding everything just beneath the surface. As the boat closed the distance, the reality of the situation became visible with the naked eye. The water ahead was disturbed by a strange, roiling energy. It wasn't just 2 animals. It was a group. Thorne grabbed his Nikon with a telephoto lens and scrambled onto the bow. The cold wind bit at his exposed face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't feel it. Through the viewfinder, the scene snapped into focus, and the impossibility of it made his breath catch in his throat. There were 3 orcas. Based on the nicks in the dorsal fins and the saddle patch markings, the gray area behind the fin that acts like a fingerprint, Thorne recognized them immediately. It was the T-137s, a well-known transient family. The matriarch, T-137, a formidable female who had been recorded killing sea lions with surgical precision. Her son, T-137A, a hulking adolescent male who was just starting to sprout the towering dorsal fin of adulthood. But swimming amongst them, weaving through the deadly gap between the mother and the son, were 4 bottlenose dolphins. They weren't panicking. They weren't being herded. They were integrating. One of the dolphins, a large male with a heavily scarred rostrum, actually rolled onto its side and rubbed its body against the flank of the orca matriarch. It was a gesture of affection, or at least of profound familiarity. It was tactile reinforcement. The orca didn't snap. She didn't tail slap. She simply adjusted her buoyancy, slowing down slightly to let the dolphin maintain contact. It was intimate. It was terrifying. Are you seeing this? Elena shouted from the helm, her eyes wide as she looked over the console. They're touching. Why aren't they eating them? Why isn't she tearing him apart? I don't know, Thorne whispered, the shutter of his camera clicking furiously, capturing evidence that would likely get him laughed out of the peer review board meetings unless the photos were crystal clear. It's a mixed species pod. It's an alliance. This phenomenon, while rare, was not entirely unprecedented in the annals of marine science, but it was usually observed in different contexts. False killer whales and bottlenose dolphins had been seen traveling together in New Zealand. Pilot whales and dolphins sometimes mingled, but transients, the mammal eaters? It was like watching a pack of wolves adopting a flock of sheep, not to eat them, but to run with them. It defied the caloric imperative of the wild. The boat drifted closer, the engines cut to idle to minimize acoustic disturbance. A mixed pod was moving south, hugging the contour of the underwater shelf. Thorne lowered his camera and picked up the hydrophone Araya, underwater microphone designed to listen to the ocean chatter. He dropped the sensor over the side, watching the cable disappear into the black water, and put on his headphones. The ocean is a noisy place. It crackles with the sound of snapping shrimp, the groan of shifting rocks, and the distant hum of freighter engines. But cutting through the static was a complex, layered symphony of biological sound. Thorne expected to hear the distinct calls of the 2 species, the whistles and clicks of the dolphins overlapping with the pulsed calls of the orcas. He expected a cacophony of confusion, but what he heard made him frown. They're mimicking, he said, adjusting the gain on the receiver, pressing the headphones tighter to his ears. Who? The orcas. They aren't using their standard hunting dialect. They're modifying their pitch. They're shortening the pulse duration. They're trying to sound like dolphins. He listened closer. The dolphins were doing it too. They were slowing their click trains down, dropping the frequency to match the lower resonance of the whales. They were meeting in the middle. They were creating a pidgin language, a temporary acoustic bridge that allowed them to coordinate in real time. Coordinate what? Elena asked, looking at the empty gray water stretching out toward the horizon. There's nothing out here. Just open water. That we can see, Thorne said. But they aren't looking with their eyes. The behavior of the pod began to shift. The playful rubbing and synchronous swimming stopped abruptly. The group spread out. The Orcas took the center channel, diving deep, their massive black bodies disappearing into the gloom like submarines. The dolphins fanned out to the flanks, racing ahead, skimming the surface like outriders. It was a formation. It was a tactical deployment. They're sweeping, Thorne realized, watching the sonar screen on the dash. The dolphins are the scouts. They're using their speed and their high-frequency echolocation to scan the upper water column. The Orcas are the heavy artillery, holding back, saving their energy, waiting for a target lock. For what? Fish? Helena suggested. Maybe a massive salmon run? Sometimes transients switch if they're starving. Transients don't eat fish, Thorne said grimly. They wouldn't waste this much energy for salmon. It goes against their culture. And dolphins usually hunt fish. If they're working together, the target has to be something that neither of them can handle easily on their own. Something high value. Something dangerous. The boat rocked as a heavy swell passed beneath them. The atmosphere on the water had changed. The playful curiosity of the initial sighting had evaporated, replaced by a palpable tension that radiated from the animals. They were in hunting mode. The silence of the Orcas was heavy. They had gone stealth. They were running silent. Suddenly, the dolphins on the eastern flank erupted. They began to porpoise violently, leaping 10 feet into the air, slapping their tails against the water. Slap, slap, slap. It wasn't play. It was a signal. It was a flare going up. We found it. The water in the center of the formation boiled. The 3 Orcas surfaced in an explosion of white water, breathing hard and then accelerated. They hit 40 kilometers per hour in seconds, their dorsal fins cutting the water like knives. They were heading straight for the spot the dolphins had indicated. Thorne scrambled back to the helm. Follow them, full throttle, don't lose them. The Sentient lurched forward, slamming over the waves as they tried to keep pace with the Titans. The chase led them toward a narrow inlet between 2 rocky islands, a place known to locals as Devil's Throat because of the treacherous currents and whirlpools that swirled there. As they rounded the headland, the mist clearing slightly, they saw the target. It wasn't a school of fish. It wasn't a seal. It was a humpback whale calf. It was separated from its mother, likely confused by the currents or the geography of the inlet. It was young, perhaps only a few months old, panicking, thrashing in the shallow water, blowing mist into the air in frantic bursts. And the alliance was closing in. This was the dark truth that Thorne had feared. This wasn't a friendship born of loneliness or play. It was a military pact. The dolphins were using the Orcas to take down prey they could never touch, perhaps to scavenge the scraps, or perhaps simply to eliminate competition for resources. And the Orcas? They were using the dolphins as bird dogs. They were using them to find the needle in the haystack, leveraging the dolphins' superior echolocation to scan vast areas of ocean that the Orcas could uncover alone. The dolphins arrived first. They didn't attack directly. They corralled. They swam circles around the terrified calf, creating a wall of bubbles and noise, confusing it, keeping it disoriented, preventing it from fleeing into the deep water where it might escape. They were the sheepdogs of hell. Then the Orcas arrived. The water turned into a cauldron of violence. T-137, the matriarch, hit the calf from below, a battering ram of 5 tons hitting soft flesh. The calf was lifted bodily out of the water, its spine arching in agony. Thorne watched, appalled and mesmerized. He had seen orca hunts before. He had seen dolphin hunts. But he had never seen this. The integration was seamless. When the calf tried to roll, dolphins were there to block it. When it tried to dive, an orca was there to push it up. They were dismantling the young whale with a terrifying cross-species efficiency. It was methodical. It was industrial. "It's a slaughter," Elena whispered, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes tearing up. "It's collaborative warfare," Thorne corrected, his voice flat, trying to maintain his scientific detachment. "We used to think humans were the only ones who formed alliances with other species to hunt. We use dogs. We use falcons. We thought we were unique in that capacity." He looked at the water, which was beginning to turn a dark, rusty red. "We were wrong, but the hunt wasn't the strangest part. As the calf weakened, its movements slowing as the blood loss took its toll, the dynamic changed again. The orcas backed off. They stopped ramming. They waited. One of the dolphins swam to the calf's head. It wasn't biting. It was nudging. It was pushing the calf down. It was covering the calf's blowhole, drowning it. And the orcas watched. They were letting the dolphins take the lead on the kill. Why? Why would an apex predator delegate the killing blow? Thorne zoomed in with his camera. He needed to see the eyes. He needed to see the intent. He focused on the lead dolphin, the large male who was holding the calf down. That was when he noticed the scar on the dolphin's flank. It was momentary, visible only as the animal rolled to get better leverage. It wasn't a jagged tear from a shark or a scrape from a rock. It was a geometric brand. A series of 3 parallel lines, perfectly spaced, intersected by a perpendicular slash. It looked like the marks of a propeller, healed over years, but the spacing was too perfect. It was too clean. It looked like a serial number. Thorne lowered the camera. A cold chill, colder than the wind, settled at the base of his spine. "Elena," he said quietly, "pull the archival footage of the dolphins from the U.S. Navy program in San Diego, the ones they released in the 90s, the experimental unit." "What? Why?" "Just do it. Look for branding marks. Look for ID code roughly translated to the Trident." The water in front of them churned as the calf took its final breath, sinking beneath the red foam. The Alliance had won. But as Thorne watched the orcas and dolphins begin to feast together, sharing the spoils of the war, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't looking at nature. He was looking at something that had been influenced, something that learned how to organize. The fog began to thicken, rolling in from the open ocean to hide the carnage. The sound of the feasting, the tearing of flesh, the splashes, the excited whistles, was muffled by the mist. "Dr. Thorne?" Elena's voice was trembling as she looked at her tablet. "I found the records. There was a release of specialized assets in 1998. Bottlenose dolphins trained for mine retrieval and swimmer nullification. The program was officially shut down, but reports say not all assets were recovered. Did they have markings?" "Yes," she said, turning the screen toward him. 3 parallel lines on the right flank. A trident. Thorne looked back at the water. The dolphin with the scar was breaching, a piece of whale blubber in its mouth, chattering to the orca matriarch. This wasn't just evolution. This was blowback. The dolphins hadn't just learned to hunt with orcas. They had taught the orcas how to hunt like soldiers. The boat drifted in the silence of the aftermath. The realization hung in the air, heavier than the fog. The ocean had always been a battlefield, but now it seemed the soldiers were professionalizing, and they were just getting started. The red tide of the kill was dissipating, spreading into thin coppery ribbons across the gray surface of the inlet. The feeding frenzy had settled into a grim, satisfied rhythm. Dr. Aris Thorne stood on the deck of the Sentient, his camera lowered, staring at the dolphin with the scar markings. It was distinct now that he knew what to look for. 3 parallel lines, slightly raised, darker than the surrounding skin. It was an unnatural geometry. In nature, scars are chaotic jagged tears from shark teeth, uneven punctures from propeller blades, circular lesions from cookie-cutter sharks. These lines were uniform. They were spaced with a mathematical precision that screamed of human intervention. They were a barcode of history. "Elena," Thorne said, his voice low, careful not to carry across the water, as if the animals could understand English, thought that felt less paranoid and more plausible by the second. Did the Navy report say anything about social training? Did they teach them to interact with other species? Elena was scrolling frantically through the PDF on her ruggedized tablet, the blue light illuminating her pale face against the darkening afternoon. It's redacted heavily, black bars over half the pages. But the unauthorized addendums, Dr. Thorne, there was a project listed in the appendix called Cetacean Integration. The theory was that if dolphins could be trained to act as forward biological sonars for submarines, maybe they could also be trained to recruit local populations, to create force multipliers. Force multipliers, Thorne repeated, the sterile military jargon tasting like ash in his mouth. They tried to turn Flipper into a special forces recruiter. The implication was terrifying. If this dolphin, let's call him Trident, was a product of that program, escaped or released, he wasn't just a smart animal. He was a veteran. He carried a doctrinal understanding of teamwork and asset utilization that no wild animal possessed. He understood the concept of a diversion. He understood the utility of a heavy assault unit. And he had passed that doctrine on, not to other dolphins, but to the most powerful predators in the ocean. He had radicalized the Orcas. The water shifted near the boat. T-137A, the massive adolescent male orca, surfaced slowly. He didn't blow. He just hung there, logging, his massive pectoral fins acting as stabilizers. His eye, a dark sphere set in the black skin just forward of the white patch, fixed on the boat. Usually, transients were indifferent to research boats unless harassed. They viewed them as floating logs, but T-137A wasn't indifferent. He was assessing. He was checking the perimeter. Then, Trident surfaced next to him. The dolphin nudged the orca's jaw with a familiarity that defied every instinct of self-preservation. The orca opened its mouth slightly, exposing teeth the size of bananas, and the dolphin dropped a piece of the humpback calf's tongue, the richest, most prized meat, into the water in front of the giant. The orca ignored the food. It kept watching the boat. It seemed to be waiting for a command, or perhaps confirmation that the sector was clear. "We need to leave," Elena whispered, stepping back from the gunwale. "They're done eating. Now they're bored. And I don't want to be the entertainment." Thorne nodded. He moved to the helm and engaged the transmission. The prop spun, churning the water, sending a vibration through the hull. Immediately, the orca sank. It didn't dive with a flourish. It just dropped vertically, like a stone slipping into a well. Trident shattered, a sharp, staccato burst of sound that cut through the air and vanished beneath the surface. "Sonar," Thorne ordered, gripping the wheel. "Keep eyes on them. I want to know where they are every second." Elena watched the screen, her fingers tracing the blobs of color. Multiple contacts, still under the boat. "They aren't dispersing, Dr. Thorne. They're matching our speed. Push it to 20 knots. Ascension surged forward, the bow rising as it planed over the chop. They raced out of Devil's Throat, heading for the open water of the Strait of Georgia. Thorne wanted distance. He wanted the safety of the marina, but the contacts didn't drop back. They stayed in the blind spot, right under the prop wash, surfing the pressure wave created by the boat's hull. "They're escorting us," Thorne said, checking the GPS. "Or hurting us." The radio crackled. It wasn't the rhythmic static of atmospheric interference. It was a rhythmic modulated burst on the emergency frequency. Channel 16. Vessel, sentient, Thorne froze. He grabbed the mic, his hand shaking. Station calling sentient, say again? You are breaking up. Turn. South. The voice was not human. It was flat, devoid of inflection, wet, and gravelly. It sounded like stones grinding together in a cavern. It sounded synthesized, or mimicked by a throat not designed for speech. Who is this? Thorne demanded. Identify yourself. Away from the island, then silence. Just the hiss of the ocean. That wasn't a person, Alana said, her voice trembling, her eyes wide with a primal fear. The cadence. It was wrong. It sounded like mimicry, Thorne finished. Orcas can mimic human speech. We know that. Wiki, the orca in France, learned to say hello and bye-bye and Amy. But that was in a controlled tank, with trainers repeating the words for months. This, he looked at the water. This is tactical communication. That wasn't hello, Dr. Thorne, Elena whispered. That was a navigational command. Thorne looked at the sonar. The orcas had spread out. They were forming a V formation behind the boat, blocking any retreat to the north or west. They were funneling the sentient toward a specific vector. They were hurting them, indeed. But why south? South led to Active Pass, a narrow, treacherous cut between Galiano and Main Islands. It was the primary artery for the heavy ferries connecting the mainland to Vancouver Island. It was a high-traffic shipping lane, a choke point. It was dangerous for whales. Ferries, tankers, tugs. It was a noise-polluted highway where cetaceans usually feared to tread. Why would they push the boat there? Unless they wanted a witness. Or unless they were setting another trap, and they needed the sentient out of the way. Or perhaps they wanted the humans to see what came next. I'm not turning south, Thorne said, gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. We're going to the marina at Nanaimo. That's west. I'm not taking orders from a whale. He banked the boat hard to starboard, aiming for the open water. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The orca on the starboard flank, the matriarch T-137, breached. She launched her 6-ton body completely out of the water, clearing the surface by 10 feet, a black missile against the gray sky. She didn't land cleanly. She crashed down broadside to the boat, parallel to the hull. The displacement wave hit the sentient like a physical blow. The 20-foot aluminum boat tipped violently to port, taking green water over the gunnel. Equipment cases slid across the deck, slamming into the opposite rail. Elena screamed, grabbing the console to keep from being thrown overboard. They're blocking us, Thorne yelled, fighting the wheel to right the vessel before they capsized. They won't let us turn west. They want us to go south. Elena cried, soaking wet, shivering from shock and cold. Just go south. Do what they say. Thorne straightened the wheel. He pointed the bow south, toward Active Pass. The whales settled instantly. The aggressive breaches stopped. They resumed their escort position, surfing the wake, silent guardians of their prisoners. We're hostages, Thorne realized, the absurdity and horror of the situation washing over him. We are being moved. We are assets being repositioned on a board we can't even see. They traveled for an hour. The gray sky darkening as a storm front moved in from the Pacific. The wind picked up, whipping the tops of the waves into whitecaps. The sentient was a small speck in a hostile ocean, guarded by a biological fleet that moved with military precision. As they approached the mouth of Active Pass, the water traffic increased. The heavy thrum of diesel engines vibrated through the water. A massive BC Ferries vessel, the Spirit of British Columbia, a 500-foot behemoth carrying hundreds of cars and passengers, was chugging through the narrow S-curve of the channel. Its horn blasted a deep, mournful warning in the fog. There, Thorne said, pointing at the white superstructure of the ferry, looming in the mist. The ferry. If we get close to it, maybe the noise will scatter them. Or maybe the captain will see us. He pushed the throttle forward, aiming for the wake of the ferry. The Orcas didn't scatter. They accelerated. They moved past the sentient, ignoring it now that they had delivered it to the theater of operations. And then Thorne saw what the trap was. Ahead of the ferry, in the narrowest part of the channel, where the current ripped through at 6 knots, the water was disturbed, not by wind, by bodies, hundreds of them. It was a superpod of dolphins. Pacific white-sided dolphins, bottlenose, even a few Dall's porpoises. They were churning the water, creating a chaotic wall of acoustic noise and bubbles. "They're blocking the ferry," Elena said, looking through the binoculars, her hands shaking. "They're swimming right across the bow. It's a suicide run." The ferry captain blasted the horn again, 5 short, sharp blasts. The universal signal for danger. Collision imminent. The massive ship initiated an emergency stop. The water at the stern turned into a frothing white maelstrom as the massive propellers reversed, fighting the ship's momentum. The hull shuddered, the steel groaning as it fought the current. The ferry slowed, drifting sideways, losing steerage. It was dead in the water. And then the T-137s, the pod that had escorted Thorne, peeled off. They shot toward the stalled ferry like torpedoes. "They stopped the ship," Thorne whispered, watching the strategic masterpiece unfold. The Dolphins acted as a biological blockade to force the ship to stop, playing on the captain's reluctance to run over 1,000 animals. And now the Orcas are moving in. To do what? Elena asked. Attack a ferry? It's steel. It's 400 feet long. They can't sink it. They aren't attacking the hull, Thorne said, watching the Orcas dive near the stern of the ferry. They're attacking the propulsion, just like the Dolphins were trained to do with mines. Disable the mobility. The Orcas disappeared under the stern of the ferry. Moments later, the water around the ferry's rudder turned dark. Thick, black oil bubbled to the surface. Hydraulic fluid. The ferry listed slightly as the stabilizers were rammed. The horn blasted continuously now, a sound of mechanical panic that echoed off the canyon walls of the pass. Trident, the scarred dolphin, surfaced near the sentient. He spy-hopped, lifting his head high out of the water. He looked at Thorne. He chattered again. It sounded different this time. Less like a command, more like a boast. He wants us to see this, Thorne said, feeling a strange connection to the animal. He brought us here to witness the capability. It's a demonstration. A demonstration for whom? For us. For humans. They're shutting down the channel. They're establishing a blockade. They are showing us that they can stop our commerce. The radio erupted again. This time, it was the ferry captain, broadcasting on Channel 16, his voice tight with disbelief. Mayday, Mayday. This is Spirit of British Columbia. We have lost steering and propulsion. We are drifting onto the rocks at Georgina Point. We are under attack by marine life. Repeat, we are being rammed. The rudder is jammed. Request immediate tug assistance. Thorne picked up his own mic. Coast Guard, this is Research Vessel Sentient. I am on scene. The ferry is surrounded by a coordinated multi-species pod. Do not send small craft. They will be swamped. This is a hostile event. Research Vessel Sentient, stand by, the Coast Guard dispatcher replied, her voice clipped and professional, trying to mask the absurdity of the report. We have a cutter en route. ETA 10 minutes. 10 minutes is too long, Thorne said, watching the ferry drift closer to the jagged shoreline. The current is pushing them onto the rocks. He looked at the Orcas. They were working the ferry's hull like a team of wreckers. They were synchronized. They were methodical. Trident. Thorne shouted at the dolphin, feeling ridiculous, effectively yelling at a fish, but desperation took hold. Stop them. You'll kill the passengers. The dolphin sank, ignoring him. The concept of collateral damage was apparently not part of his doctrine. Then, a new sound cut through the water. A high-pitched mechanical whine that rose above the wind. A Zodiac, a fast, rigid inflatable boat with a reinforced hull, was speeding toward them from the island side. It was black, unmarked, sitting low in the water with powerful quad engines. It wasn't Coast Guard. It wasn't civilian. The 4 men on board were dressed in black tactical gear. Balaclavas hid their faces. They weren't carrying rescue equipment. They were carrying AR-15 rifles. "Who are they?" Elena asked, backing away from the console. "I don't know," Thorne said. "But I don't think they're here to save the whales." The Zodiac didn't slow down. It cut straight toward the superpod of dolphins, blocking the ferry. The man in the bow raised his rifle. Crack, crack. Bullets hit the water, sending up small geysers of spray. The sound was flat and ugly. The dolphins scattered in a panic, the wall breaking apart as the water was zipped with lead. The Orcas under the ferry surfaced, sensing the new threat. T-137A roared, a sound audible above the surface. A trumpet blast of rage and charged the Zodiac. The man in the Zodiac didn't flinch. He aimed at the charging Orca. "No," Thorne screamed. He gunned the sentient, instinctively putting his boat between the Zodiac and the whale. "Don't shoot." The Zodiac swerved violently to avoid hitting Thorne's boat. The man with the rifle lowered it, glaring at Thorne through polarized sunglasses. "Clear the area, civilian vessel." The man shouted over a megaphone, his voice amplified and distorted. "This is a sanctioned containment operation. Move or be engaged. Containment?" Thorne yelled back, his anger overriding his fear. "You're shooting federally protected animals. Are you insane?" "These aren't animals," the man shouted back, raising the rifle again. "They act like assets. And assets can be decommissioned." Trident surfaced behind the Zodiac. He didn't flee. He didn't scatter with the others. He whistled, a long, piercing note that rose in pitch until it was painful to hear, vibrating inside the skull. The water around the Zodiac exploded. Not with whales, with dolphins. They launched themselves out of the water, coming from all sides. They weren't jumping for joy. They were jumping to strike. One dolphin, a massive 600-pound animal, hit the man with the rifle squarely in the chest, knocking him backward out of the boat. Another hit the helmsman, slamming him into the console. It was a kamikaze attack. They were using their bodies as kinetic missiles. The Zodiac spun out of control, the throttle unmanned. It circled wildly, running over its own crew in the water. The prop churned the sea into a red froth. T-137A reached the man in the water, the shooter. The Orca didn't bite him. He grabbed the man by the tactical vest and dragged him under. There was no struggle, just a sudden disappearance. It was over in seconds. The Zodiac was empty, circling endlessly, its engines whining. The men were gone. The ferry was grinding against the shore rocks with a sickening screech of metal, but it had stopped drifting. Thorne stared at the empty ocean. The Alliance had not only disabled a ship, they had neutralized a paramilitary hit squad. They were waiting for them. Elena whispered, her face ashen. They knew the containment team would come. The ferry. It was just bait. It was a lure to draw out the hunters. Thorne looked at the ferry, where passengers lined the decks in orange life jackets, pointing phones at the horror unfolding in the water. They had recorded everything. Trident surfaced again near the sentient. He looked at Thorne. Then he looked at the empty, circling Zodiac. He didn't smile. Dolphins can't smile. It's just the shape of their jaw, but there was a smugness in the set of his head. A cold satisfaction. He turned and swam away, leading the pod back into the deep water. The Orcas followed, leaving the scene of the crime. They left the humans to pick up the pieces. Thorne slumped against the console, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His camera was full of evidence that would change the world or get him killed. "We have to go," he said, his voice hoarse. "Before another team comes. Before the real military gets here." As he turned the boat toward Nanaimo, skirting the edge of the shipping lane, he realized the truth. The ocean wasn't just waking up. It was organizing. It had intelligence. And it had leaders. Leaders who carried the scars of human wars and had decided to start one of their own. The aftermath of the Battle of Active Pass was a masterclass in obfuscation. The official reports released by the Canadian Coast Guard and the Department of Fisheries were heavily sanitized, citing a freak navigational accident exacerbated by aggressive wildlife behavior during a mating event. The ferry was salvaged, dragged off the rocks by heavy tugs, but the shipping lane remained closed for weeks, ostensibly for environmental assessment. The bodies of the tactical team were recovered days later, washed up miles away, unmarked but drowned. Their identities were erased. Number families came forward. No obituaries were printed. The public was fed a story about engine failure and rogue waves, a narrative comfortable enough to ignore. But in the windowless, soundproof backrooms of Naval Intelligence and Marine Biology Institute's the video. Footage from Dr. Thorne's camera was playing on a loop, analyzed frame by frame, by men who didn't care about biology, only about threat assessment. Thorne and Elena were not arrested. That would have drawn too much attention. Instead, they were debriefed. For 12 hours in a gray room in Vancouver, men in gray suits asked them the same questions over and over. What did you see? Did the Dolphins signal the attack? Did the Orca respond to a specific command? Did you hear any synthesized speech? They released them with a strict non-disclosure agreement that threatened federal prison for any leaks, and a threat that hung in the air like ozone. Do not go back out there. It is not safe. The water is a restricted zone. But curiosity is a disease that has no cure, and fear is a powerful motivator. 3 months later, Thorne was back on the water. Not in the Sentient, which had been impounded for evidence, but in a rented, rusted trawler called the Storm Crow. Elena was with him. They had moved north, away from the heavy scrutiny of the Strait of Georgia, to the remote, mist-shrouded fjords of the Great Bear Rainforest. They were off the grid. They weren't looking for the T-137s. They were looking for the source. If Trident had been a military asset, where had he come from? And were there others? The answer came on a rainy afternoon in March. They were drifting in a deep inlet, the engine off, listening to the hydrophone. The water was quiet, save for the patter of rain on the surface. Then, a sound cut through the silence. It wasn't a call. It was a ping. Ping, ping, ping. It was mechanical. 30 kilohertz. The frequency of a tracking tag. But it was irregular, stuttering. Someone's tagged one of them, Elena whispered, adjusting the headset, her eyes wide. It's close, but the signal is weak. They followed the signal into a narrow, mist-choked valley where the cedar trees grew down to the waterline, their branches trailing in the black water. The depth sounder read 400 feet. At the end of the inlet, hidden from the air by the canopy and the fog, they found it. It wasn't a natural cove. It was a facility, or what was left of one. Rusted floating pens, covered in moss and barnacles, lined the shore. Concrete bunkers, overgrown with ferns and blackberry bushes, stared out at the water with empty, dark windows. A faded, bullet-riddled sign on a chain-link fence read, "Government property, nitrogen monoxide trespassing. Project, Deep Blue. Authorized personnel only. This is it," Thorne said, bringing the trawler alongside a rotting dock, the wood groaning under the weight. "This is where they trained them. This is the school." They tied up and climbed onto the dock. The silence was absolute. No birds. No wind. Just the drip of water. They walked past the empty pens. The heavy gauge netting was torn, hanging in shreds. Something had broken out, or broken in. Inside the main bunker, papers were scattered on the floor, rotted by damp and time. Metal filing cabinets were overturned. Thorne picked one up, a soggy logbook. The ink was faded, but legible. Subject, Trident. Date, February 1999. Behavior, aggressive. Integration scoring, 98%. Recommendation, release. They released him because he was too aggressive. Elena asked, shining her flashlight on the moldy pages. No. Thorne read further, his voice chilling. They released him because he was too effective. He started improvising. He started trying to teach the other subjects how to remove their harnesses. He was organizing a labor strike. Thorne dropped the book. He was a revolutionary even then. They dumped him in the wild, hoping he'd die or assimilate. Instead, he radicalized the locals. A massive splash outside made them jump. They ran back to the dock, hearts pounding. In the center of the inlet, floating near the old pens, was Trident. The scar on his flank was bright white in the gloom. He wasn't alone. The inlet was full. It was a congregation. Orcas, dolphins, stellar sea lions, harbor seals. Species that should be eating each other were floating side by side, their heads raised, looking at the dock. They weren't fighting. They were waiting. And in the center of the gathering, a massive northern elephant seal, a creature that usually spent its life alone in the deep ocean, diving a mile down, was floating on its back. It was the size of a minivan. Trident swam to the elephant seal. He chattered. The seal grunted, a deep, resonant sound that echoed off the cliff walls like thunder. They're recruiting, Thorne realized, gripping the railing. It's not just a blockade, it's a council. They are building a coalition. The elephant seal rolled over and dove, disappearing into the black water. The Orcas followed. Trident lingered for a moment, looking at Thorne on the dock. He slapped his tail once against the water. A greeting? Or a dismissal? Then he dove. Thorne looked at Elena. We just crashed a war council. What do we do? We document it, Thorne said, running for the boat. And we pray they don't decide we're the enemy. We follow them. They spent the next week camped on the storm crow, trailing the armada from a safe distance. The gathering grew. The behavior was organized. The different species practiced maneuvers. The dolphins acted as scouts, racing ahead. The seals practiced perimeter defense, forming walls. The orcas were the heavy cavalry, practicing coordinated strikes. It was an army. And then, on the seventh day, they moved. The entire flotilla turned west, toward the open ocean, toward the shipping lanes that connected Asia to North America. They're going to the line, Thorne said, checking the charts. They're going to shut it down. They aren't going after a ferry this time. They're going after the supply chain. He fired up the Storm Crow's engine. We have to follow them. The world needs to see this before the Navy starts dropping depth charges. They followed the wake of the Army for 50 miles. The ocean was alive with fins. As they reached the edge of the continental shelf, where the water turned deep blue, they saw the target. A massive container ship, the Titan, loaded with 10,000 containers, was plowing through the swell at 20 knots. It was a city of steel, unassailable. Or so it seemed. The dolphins hit first, hundreds of them. They leaped in front of the bow, creating a wall of acoustic interference that blinded the ship's sonar and depth finders. The captain, likely confused by the sudden wall of false readings, slowed down. That was the mistake. The elephant seals attacked the rudder. They jammed their massive, blubbery bodies into the mechanism, dying in the process, but clogging the gears with flesh and bone. The rudder stuck. The ship drifted broadside to the heavy Pacific swell. Then the Orcas arrived. They didn't attack the hull directly. They synchronized. 20 massive bodies hit the side of the ship at the exact same moment, timed perfectly with the roll of the swell. Boom! The ship rocked. They waited for the counter-roll. Boom! Resonance. They were rocking the ship. They were using the ocean's energy against the steel. Containers began to slide. The lashings snapped with sounds like gunshots. Massive steel boxes tumbled into the sea, splashing down like bombs. The ship listed further. The balance was lost. They're capsizing it, Elena screamed, clutching the rail. "They're going to sink a container ship," the Titan groaned. The crew was launching flares, screaming on the radio. But there was nothing anyone could do. The physics of the ocean were being turned against them by a biological intelligence that understood leverage. With a final, terrible screech of tearing metal, the Titan rolled over. It floated upside down, a massive steel island in the foam, its cargo sinking into the abyss. The ocean was silent. The army dispersed. They vanished into the blue, leaving the wreck as a monument. Thorne turned the Storm Crow around. He didn't want to see anymore. He had his story. But he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that no one would print it. No one would believe it. Because to believe, it would mean admitting that we are no longer the apex intelligence on this planet. "Dr. Thorne," Elena whispered as they motored back toward the coast, the sun setting behind them. "Look at the sonar." Thorne looked. A single red dot was following them. Trident. He wasn't escorting them. He was trailing them. He followed them all the way to the marina. He watched them dock. He watched them unload their gear under the cover of darkness. And as Thorne walked up the ramp, he looked back at the black water. Trident was there, lifting his head out of the water. He opened his mouth and let out a sound. It wasn't a click. It wasn't a whistle. It was a mimicry of a sound Thorne had heard on the radio that day. "Turn south." It was imperfect, wet, and gravelly, but the words were English. Thorne dropped his gear bag. Trident sank beneath the water one last time. The message was clear. "We know where you live. We know your language, and we are watching." Thorne and Elena drove inland that night. They didn't stop until they reached the mountains. They uploaded the footage to the cloud, encrypted, sent to a dozen servers. Then they destroyed the hard drives. They live in a cabin now, far from the sea. They don't go near the water, not even a lake, because they know the ocean isn't just a place. It's a mind, a vast, cold, connected mind that has extensive memory and zero empathy. We treated it like a resource, a dumping ground, a playground. We forgot that it covers 70% of the planet. We forgot that it surrounds us. And now, the landlord is evicting the tenants. So the next time you hear a story about a whale attacking a boat in Gibraltar, or a dolphin acting aggressively in Florida, don't dismiss it as an anomaly. Don't call it an accident. It's a probe. It's a test. They are learning our weaknesses. They are testing our defenses. And they are communicating across species lines in ways we can barely comprehend. The alliance is real. The war has started. And looking at the map, looking at the blue that surrounds the green, I don't like our odds. If you enjoyed this dive into the dark possibilities of nature, please consider subscribing. Leave a like if this story made you think twice about your next beach trip. Stay safe, stay dry, and keep watching the water. You never know what's looking back. The cabin was buried under 3 feet of snow, perched high in the Cascade Mountains, 100 miles from the nearest coastline. It was a fortress of solitude, chosen not for the view, but for the altitude. Here, the only water was frozen solid or trapped in the plumbing. Dr. Aris Thorne sat in front of a wood-burning stove, the flickering light casting long dancing shadows against the log walls. He hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the Titan went down. Beside him, on a folding table cluttered with encrypted hard drives and satellite modems, Elena monitored the pulse of a dying world. They were refugees from the future. They had seen the turning point of history, and now they were watching the rest of humanity catch up, one catastrophe at a time. The sinking of the Titan had not been an isolated incident. It was the opening salvo of a global campaign. In the weeks following the capsizing of the massive container ship, the freak accidents had metastasized like a cancer across the world's shipping lanes. In the Strait of Gibraltar, a pod of Orcas systematically disabled the rudders of 3 oil tankers in a single afternoon, leaving them to drift onto the Moroccan coast, spilling millions of gallons of crude oil. In the Panama Canal, a superpod of bottlenose dolphins, numbering in the thousands, clogged the locks, their bodies forming a living wall that refused to move, halting global trade at its most critical choke point. In the South China Sea, fishing fleets were pulling up nets filled not with tuna, but with the shredded remains of their own gear, cut with surgical precision by jaws that knew exactly where the stress points were. "Aris," Elena said, her voice hollow, her eyes fixed on a laptop screen. "You need to see this. It's the Atlantic Fleet." Thorne stood up, his joints popping, and walked to the table. The screen showed a leaked feed from a U.S. Navy drone, hovering over the North Atlantic. The gray ocean was churned white by the wake of a carrier strike group, the USS Gerald R. Ford and its armada of destroyers and cruisers. They were steaming at full combat speed, a display of the greatest projection of human power on the planet. "They're executing Operation Leviathan," Elena said. "Total acoustic sanitization. They're going to active ping the entire North Atlantic basin. They're declaring war on the ocean." Thorne watched the grainy footage. He knew what active ping meant. It meant sonar blasts of 235 decibels. It meant boiling the brains of every marine mammal within 100 miles. It was a scorched earth policy applied to the sea. "They think it's a brute force equation," Thorne whispered. "They think if they hit hard enough, the enemy will break. They don't understand. You can't break something that has no center. You can't decapitate a hydra." On the screen, the ocean began to react, but it wasn't the panic the Navy expected. The sonar domes on the destroyers lit up, sending invisible pulses of death into the deep. In a normal world, this would be the end. Whales would beach themselves to escape the pain. Dolphins would hemorrhage and die, but the ocean had been preparing. "Look at the thermal layer," Thorne pointed at the telemetry overlay. "The water temperature is dropping. They're inducing an upwelling. From the depths, thousands of pilot whales and sperm whales were swimming upward in a suicide sprint. They weren't trying to surface. They were expelling air. Millions of cubic feet of air, released simultaneously from thousands of massive lungs at a depth of 500 meters. The physics were simple, but the scale was biblical. As the air rose, it expanded. It created a massive, chaotic field of bubbles, a bubble curtain the size of a city. "Acoustic decoupling," Thorne said, awe and horror warring in his chest. "The bubbles scatter the sonar. They're creating a shield. They're jamming the Navy with their own breath. The sonar pulses hit the wall of bubbles and scattered, blinding the ships. The destroyers were deaf. And then the counterattack began. It didn't come from the big whales. It came from the small ones. Under the cover of the bubble screen, while the Navy ships were blind and deaf, the fast movers moved in. Dolphins, seals, sea lions. They swarmed the hulls of the mighty warships. They weren't attacking the steel. They were attacking the intakes. A nuclear aircraft carrier requires millions of gallons of seawater per minute to cool its reactors and condensers. The intake grates are massive, sucking in the ocean with the force of a river. The animals sacrificed themselves. They swam into the intakes. They jammed their bodies into the impellers. They're clogging the cooling systems, Elena realized, tears streaming down her face. They're dying to kill the engines. On the drone feed, the Gerald R. Ford began to vent steam. Massive plumes of white smoke erupted from the flight deck. The reactor scrammed. The ship lost power. The pride of the U.S. Navy, a $13 billion fortress, drifted helpless in the swell. It was a stalemate. The Navy couldn't shoot what they couldn't see, and they couldn't move without melting down their reactors. Thorne turned away from the screen. He couldn't watch the slaughter that would follow. The sailors would eventually start shooting into the water with small arms, but the strategic victory had already been won. The ocean had proven that it could stop the most advanced military on Earth. "It's over," Thorne said. "The age of the sea is over. We are landlocked. The economic collapse that followed was swift and brutal. Global trade relies on the cheap movement of goods by sea. When the ships stopped moving, the world stopped working. Shelves went empty. Fuel prices skyrocketed. Famine stalked nations that relied on imported grain. The blue curtain, as the media called it, had fallen. Humanity was besieged on its own continents. But the alliance wasn't done. Months passed. Winter turned to spring in the mountains. The snow melted, revealing the dark earth. Thorne and Elena survived on canned goods and the news feeds, watching the dismantling of civilization. Then, the letter came. It wasn't mailed. There was no mail service anymore. It was left on the porch of the cabin. Thorne found it one morning when he went out to chop wood. A single wet envelope, smelling of brine. Inside was a satellite phone and a single coordinate. Latitude, 49.2827 and longitude, 123.1207 W Vancouver, the waterfront. They want to parley, Thorne said, showing the coordinates to Elena. Who? The government. No, Thorne said, looking at the wet stain on the paper. The government would have kicked down the door. This is an invitation from the other side. They drove down from the mountains, passing through towns that were hollowed out by the economic crash. The roads were empty. When they reached Vancouver, the city was quiet. The harbor, usually bustling with tankers and cruise ships, was a graveyard of rusting steel. Ships sat at anchor, abandoned, covered in guano. They walked to the end of the main pier. The city skyline loomed behind them, glass towers reflecting a gray sky. The water in the harbor was glassy and calm. Thorne stood at the edge, waiting. He didn't know what to expect. A demand? A surrender? At noon, exactly, the water broke. It wasn't Trident. Trident was a soldier, a field commander. This was something else. A massive orca surfaced. But it wasn't like the transients. It was ancient. Its skin was mottled with age, white patches spreading over the black. Its dorsal fin was collapsed, flopped over to the side like a wet rag. It was Granny J2, the matriarch of the southern residents. She was estimated to be over 100 years old. She was the keeper of the lore. She had seen the ocean before the engines, before the plastics, before the noise. She logged on the surface, her blowhole huffing gently. Flanking her were 2 dolphins. And on the other side, a human. Thorne blinked. A diver? No. The figure pulled itself up onto the swim platform of the dock. It was a man, wearing a tattered wetsuit. He pulled off his mask. It was Miller, the trainer from the logbook, the one who had been executed in 1999. He looked older, his skin weathered and scarred, his eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of a man who has lived in another world. "Dr. Thorne?" Miller rasped. His voice was unused, gravelly. "They told me you were the one who listened." "You're dead," Thorne whispered. "The log said you drowned." "I was taken," Miller corrected. "I was recruited. Just like Trident. They needed a bridge. An interpreter." "They?" Miller gestured to the ancient whale. "The council. The memory of the water." "What do they want?" Elena asked, stepping forward. "They've won. They stopped the ships. They starved the world. What more do they want?" Miller looked at the city skyline, then back at the whale. "They want you to know why. They aren't doing this for revenge. Revenge is a human concept. They are doing this for quarantine." "Quarantine? The ocean is dying, Doctor. You know this. Acidification, microplastics, sonic trauma, the collapse of the food web. We were the virus. We were heeding the fever." Miller paused, listening to a series of clicks from the dolphins. "They calculated the tipping point," Miller translated. "They have an oral history that goes back 50,000 years. They remember the ice ages. They remember the meteors. They knew that if they let us continue for another 50 years, the ocean would die. And if the ocean dies, everything dies. Even them. So they decided to kill us? Thorne asked. No, they decided to contain us, to put us back in our box. The land is ours. The water is theirs. That is the treaty. That is the new law. Granny, the ancient matriarch, exhaled. A mist of rainbow spray hung in the air. And if we refuse? Thorne asked. If we nuke the ocean? If we poison it out of spite? Miller smiled, a sad, broken expression. Then they released the methane. Thorne froze. What? The clathrates, Thorne realized, his mind racing back to the geology textbooks. The frozen methane deposits on the continental shelves. Billions of tons of greenhouse gas. They know where the trigger points are, Miller said. The deep divers, the sperm whales. They've been mapping the unstable fields. They can trigger a release. A massive, coordinated release. It would turn the atmosphere into a furnace in a decade. It would be a planetary reset. A suicide pact. The silence on the pier was absolute. The threat wasn't war. It was extinction. They are holding a gun to the head of the world, Elena whispered. They are holding a shield, Miller said. They are giving the planet a fever break. The ancient whale slapped her tail gently. The meeting was over. Miller put his mask back on. Tell your leaders, tell your scientists, stay on the shore. Don't build new ships. Don't lay new cables. Let the silence return. If you do that, the fish will come back. The air will clean. We can survive. But only if we stay apart. And you? Thorne asked. Are you going back with them? Miller looked at the dark water. I don't belong on land anymore. I've heard the song. Once you hear it, you can't listen to anything else. He slipped back into the water. The dolphins flanked him. The ancient whale turned, her massive body displacing the water with a majestic slowness. They submerged. Thorne and Elena stood on the pier for a long time, watching the ripples fade. The message was delivered. The treaty was non-negotiable. They returned to the cabin in the mountains, but they didn't hide anymore. Thorne wrote the paper. He published the findings. He told the world the terms of the surrender. Some didn't believe it. Some called for nuclear strikes on the ocean. But the majority looked at the empty grocery shelves, the quiet harbors, the healing skies, and they accepted. Humanity retreated. We became a terrestrial species again. We looked at the blue expanse on the map not as a highway, but as a border. A border guarded by an intelligence older and more patient than our own. Years later, Thorne sat by a river, miles inland. It was the Salmon Run. For the first time in decades, the river was choked with fish. The water was silver with life. A bear waded into the water, catching a salmon. An eagle watched from a tree. And in the middle of the river, far from the salt, a single seal head popped up. It looked at the bear. It looked at the eagle. Then it looked at Thorne. It held his gaze for a long moment. It wasn't a look of fear. It was a look of supervision. The wardens were still watching. Thorne nodded to the seal. We are behaving, he thought. We are staying in our box. The seal dipped beneath the surface, swimming back toward the sea, back to the vast, silent empire that surrounded the small, noisy islands of men. This story is a reminder that dominance is temporary. We walk this earth with the arrogance of landlords, forgetting that we are merely tenants on a lease we have violated time and time again. We look for alien intelligence in the stars, desperate for contact, while ignoring the minds that share our gravity. The ocean is not empty space. It is a nation. It is a superpower. And as we push it to the brink, we must ask ourselves, what happens when the sleeping giant wakes up? What happens when the immune system recognizes the pathogen? The friendship between the orca and the dolphin was not a quirk of nature. It was a warning, a sign that the tribes of the deep are uniting. And against a united ocean, we have no defense. So the next time you stand at the shoreline, toes in the sand, looking out at the infinite horizon, remember, you are standing at the border of a foreign country. Respect the line, because the eyes looking back from the deep are no longer curious. They are waiting. If this story made you look at the blue map on your wall a little differently, if it made you realize how small we really are, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Share this with someone who needs to know. We have more stories from the edge of the wild coming soon. Stay safe, stay dry, and remember, don't wake the deep.